Hello and welcome to the Endgame class. My name is Caleb Denby, and today I wanted to walk you guys through everybody's favorite opening in chess. That is the Berlin. Now, I hear you protesting at home. This is an endgame class, not an opening class. Well, can't they just be the same thing sometimes? And that is exactly the case with the classic Berlin endgame line. Now, this is one that is played quite often at the top level of chess. It's kind of seen as the easiest way for black to try to equalize against the Ruy Lopez, and of course, that has made it very, very popular. So why don't we see Maxime Vachier-Lagrave's take on the Berlin endgame. Now, he has been trying to fight for the win in a position that honestly has pretty much well been agreed to just be a draw. So let's see it. Of course, the Berlin starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop e5, entering the Ruy. Now, of course, a6 has for a long time been the main line of the Ruy Lopez, but in this case, the Berlin comes after knight f6. Now, in this case, I wanted to go over the main line, which is the endgame line. There is this move d3 available to white if white does want to avoid the endgame line, wants to play a more classical Ruy type of position, but black has been equalizing pretty comfortably with the move bishop c5 here. And I won't go into all that because this is an endgame class. So castles, knight takes e4, d4 is the way to play it for white. Rook e1 is seen to be largely just a draw. So d4, knight d6, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, d takes e5, and now after knight f5, we have queen takes d8 and king takes d8. And this is the classic Berlin quote-unquote endgame. Of course, there are still quite a few pieces on the board to call it an endgame, but it kind of just is an endgame, and I more or less say that because in this type of position, yes, the king can still come under a little bit of fire, but it is still going to be an active fighting piece for black especially. And, you know, everybody just seems to agree that this is an endgame. So now MVL is kind of the player that's, you know, it's hard to tell what came first. Did MVL just start playing the main line of the Berlin, or did MVL's line against the Berlin sort of just become the main line because he kept playing it and kept doing it pretty decently with it as well? So let's look and see how he starts here. There are two really main moves, knight c3 and h3. The move rook d1 check has also been tried quite a few times. Even moves like b3 have been played here. There are a lot of options for white in this case, but I wanted to look at h3, which is kind of the same as knight c3. We kind of transpose immediately after the main move, king e8. And king e8 is one of the main options for black in the Berlin. The move king e8 is kind of seen as the less ambitious try by black if black wants to sometimes win the game. Generally, they don't play king e8, instead opting for the move bishop d7, when the king is actually going to look to come out this way via c8 instead of coming back to e8. But king e8 is kind of the main try for black. It is the most respected way to kind of just try to equalize the game. And now knight c3 by MVL, and we are in very standard territory. Now there are once again quite a few options for black. The move bishop e6, the move bishop e7 all come to mind. But if you do play like this, you're ever so slightly giving white what he wants. Move h3 was intended to help prepare the move g4. Now after g4, knight e7, white has the option to always kind of bring this king just up the board a little bit. The move knight d4 and knight g5 are also kind of the main tries here, forcing this bishop back. And now moves like king g2 can follow, as well as moves like f4. Just for example, king g2, c5 hits this knight, knight back to f3. Let's say b5, and you know, even king g3 here. And this is kind of a nice solid setup for white. I don't want to get into this too much though, because due to these g4 ideas with stuff like knight d4, with stuff like that, the main move for black has very much become to just play the move h5. With h5, you're kind of nipping g4 in the bud by challenging that square before it ever gets played. So now if you play the move g4, well, you're kind of just in for it. Knight h6, and this guy is very, very weak. If you play the move g5, knight f5 is great for black now, and this is just awful, awful, awful stuff for white. So h5 is quite common, and now white simply develops this piece to bishop f4. Bishop e7 is natural for black to get developed. Now the move rook a d1, bishop e6, and knight g5 is the way that MVL has been trying to play for an advantage. And there are 180 some games here. And the reason white can go for this knight g5 stuff is because black did in fact commit to this h5 move, trying to challenge the d4 square. This is kind of the drawback to playing h5. You give your opponent the g5 square. No need to fear, though. In 179 of those 180 some games, the move rook h6 comes on the board, defending this bishop on e6. Now, the move knight takes e6 is playable, but this is very much nothing to worry about for black here. This was kind of an extra bishop. If white miraculously in this position had a light squared bishop instead of this knight, I would kind of say that white is close to winning, but there is no light squared bishop on the board. So the fact that this bishop has disappeared is less important for black. Much more common instead now are the moves g3 and rook fe1, and I'm going to recommend the move rook fe1 that MVL plays in this game. Bishop b4 is the follow-up for black, trying to pressure this knight. Note that it is possible to play other things, but if you play something slow, like the move b6, well, you do have to look out for this knight starting to come in, starting to try to invade, and another kind of nonchalant move, and you might actually end up in just a smidgen of trouble. Sorry, I won't play c5. c5 is kind of a bad move. Let's say you just directly pass. You might end up in just a smidgen of trouble after something like takes and takes, and just like g3. And this knight is nice and centralized. Moves like knight g5 can come at a later date, and white is just kind of happy here. So bishop b4 is aimed at preventing this knight from coming to the natural e4 square, and now white just does actually continue with the move g4. And after h takes g4, h takes g4, knight e7, this is where MVL kind of deviates from the most common move in this position. When grandmasters get to this position and they kind of just want to make a draw, the move knight takes e6 is the move you're going to see most often. Rook takes e6, rook e3, and there just isn't a whole lot to play for here. But the move that MVL played in this game is actually going to be trying for just a little bit more. MVL plays the very, very interesting move f3. And so with f3, white is actually giving black quite a bit. This is taking some risks, to be sure. So who sees what risks are being taken? What does the move f3 allow for black? What can black do here? What can black do in this position? Does anybody see? Rook h8, not going to be rook h8 in this case. Of course, the thing that f3 does in fact allow, of course this is not capturing the bishop on e6, which does mean the move bishop takes c3 can be played and has been played in all 8 games in which this position has appeared. And now, with this bishop still alive, black can actually gain a pawn on the a2 square. And that is what Magnus Carlsen tries in this game against MVL. And the fun doesn't really end there. After giving up this a2 pawn, MVL plays this move knight e4, aiming for the nice c5 square, hitting some weaknesses. And after rook h8, I dare you guys to find white's next move. This is more or less the justification for allowing bishop takes c3 and bishop takes a2. So this is the justification for the sacrifice. See if you can find MVL's next move here. What can be done? move knight f6 is a check, and it does look pretty interesting, but unfortunately it is not going to be enough here. And yeah, some people in the chat do have it now. It is, in fact, the move e6 rather instead. e6 is the idea for white to fracture the black structure and create some threats to black's perfectly safe central king. So if you do play the move knight f6, g takes f6, e takes f6, bishop e6, takes, this would likely be enough for an equal position. But after knight f6, captures are not always forced in chess, and king f8 might actually be just a good move here. Now your knight is attacked, you have to give another check or come back. And if you do give this check and come to c5, this is just going to be fine for black. You got a couple checks, but not much else. So the move e6 is the move to play here. Now bishop takes e6. Of course, white doesn't want to give away too many pawns, so bishop takes c7 is played in the game. And so, you know, now we just end up with this funny looking position here where black is actually up a clean pawn and white has a fractured structure. So what does white have in return for this? Well, white does get kind of some annoying activity, and that's why I think this is one of the lines for white that really offers at least some winning chances. You know, it's not just totally dead. White sacrifices this pawn on the queen's side, but you know, these pieces very centralized, this king also very centralized, and these pieces a little bit uncoordinated here, just a little bit uncoordinated. The move knight d5 is what the world champion went for in this game. Now there is one other game in the database here that I do want to briefly touch on after we go over this game. And in that game, Anish Giri and Sergei Karjakin were playing. Sergei played the move b5, and we'll see how that went for Anish. But in this case, knight d5, bishop up to e5, and king f8 defends this pawn on g7. Of course, bishop was attacked. We get the bishop out with tempo. Now, the natural follow-up for white, you know, the point of this e6 sacrifice was, yes, to gain c7, but also to play this move, knight c5, hitting two things at once. b5 is played for black, and now once again, I want you guys to find the next critical move for white here to keep the game going, to keep his chances alive. The next critical move, what do you guys think? What do you think? So I'm at Jesus has the right idea here. These pawns are awful. They're awful, awful pawns, and you should hate them. So, of course, the best move in this case is going to be to play the move c4. With c4, you're challenging this knight on d5 and this pawn on b5. Black, of course, is not so happy to let you take on b5, so b takes c4 comes on the board. And white has now sacrificed a second pawn, but in return, he has really fractured these pawns. He's gotten rid of one of his weaknesses, and he's opened up the b file as well. Now, the move rook b1 directly isn't actually going to really be good enough here for white, largely because rook h6 is starting to activate, and if you go even further, play a move like rook b7, you're not actually attaining anything. The move bishop c8 very quickly ejects this rook, and suddenly there are no safe squares for this rook to go to. You have to go either to b8 and trade, or back to b2 or b1. So not really what you're looking for. But you do create more weaknesses for your opponent. In the game, MVL plays the move rook d4, and this one is a pretty good one, challenging this pawn on c4. Now, the move rook e8 is the world champion's trying to challenge this rook on the open e file. Rook takes c4, regains one of the pawns for MVL. Of course, black really couldn't hold on to all of these weak pawns at the same time. If you do play a move like knight b6, trying to defend, well, now maybe is the time to take here. And all of a sudden, you know, you start getting a little bit nervous with black here. These rooks can very, very quickly invade into the position if you don't play it with extreme caution here. And that's, once again, why I think MVL's take on the Berlin is one of the best. So Magnus sacrifices this pawn back with the move rook e8. Rook takes c4 comes on the board. And now rook back up to h6 is Magnus's play. He's just desperately trying to get these rooks back into the game so that he can challenge White's claim to all this activity. Now, the very, very natural move by MVL. You want to step out of this threat and you want to attack Black's weaknesses, so the move rook a4 comes on the board. And now Magnus Carlsen, rather than kind of stubbornly try to hold on to these pawns at all costs, plays the move king g8. And now, after rook takes a7, material is even, but the position is not even, in my opinion. I think in this case, Magnus has played pretty good defense so far, getting the pieces active, not being too greedy with the material. But I do think that White does have a little bit of an edge in this position. Now, of course, it's not much, but you're playing against the Berlin, so it's really difficult to ask for much. But MVL has somehow outmaneuvered his opponent. He has slightly more activity with his pieces, and now all of the pawns that Magnus had as compensation have fallen off the board. The move bishop c8 is what Magnus tried in order to once again begin challenging this bishop here and this rook on e1. And now I think MVL plays a move that really does allow Magnus to more or less totally equalize in this position. I think the move that had to be played to play it for any kind of an advantage is the move king f2. And the reason I think this is really the only way to play for an edge is because this move is aimed at actually playing against this rook on h6. So rook on h6 has a difficult time of getting back into play from this square. Now, Black's last move of bishop c8 was bishop c8, and the idea of this move was to continue now with f6. The point being, you want to trade off these rooks. But now, of course, the downside to this is that this rook cannot get back into the game using this 6th rank. There are checks, but these checks don't really get you anywhere either. If you start playing things like rook f1, well, you've suddenly strayed a little bit too far away, and this bishop is going to come under some fire. So in this line, the move rook h8 is actually necessary for Black to play, to guard this 8th rank. And after rook h8, you know, now White has some extra time to continue playing against the pieces with this rook being so far out of play for the moment. In fact, a move like c4 is also well worth considering. When knight takes c7, I think is simply just going to be lost. This bishop cannot legally move, and it's going to be really tough to play this position for Black. This pawn is going to fall. Just one example. Of course, other moves are playable here, like knight e3, hitting this pawn, so maybe c4 isn't even the best. King d2 could be good. But okay, I think king f2 would have given MVL that little bit of an edge that he was still playing for. Instead, bishop g3 was his choice, and I do think this lets Black off just a little bit easy. Rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, and now, of course, what is the improvement for Black in this line over the previous line? How is this better for Black than what we just looked at? What extra option does he have available? And then there's a question about bishop d6 check. I'll come back to that. But first, you guys answer my question. So yeah, you guys see the idea. Rook d6 gets this rook to a much more central location. And now Black is just quite comfortably holding on to this position. Let's back up, though. After c4, b takes c4. Why not play bishop d6 check? Bishop d6 check is a playable move, and then we can continue by taking this pawn here. And you do get this bishop versus knight endgame. The problem is, due to some awkwardness in the white pieces, you can't immediately generate any threats against this king. King f7 is a really nice, kind of important move for white. If you double up here, well, now rook e8, not rook f8, rook e8, and immediately, you know, pieces start coming off the board, and white is still going to be down a pawn here. So rather than go for those immediate simplifications, we did see this rook d4 move instead, trying to keep a few more pieces on the board, trying to keep more chances alive. Okay, so then we ended up here, bishop g3, and after rook d6, I think the game was well in hand for the world champion. Bishop a5 was played, trying to guard the d8 square, but now Magnus comes up with this nice move. Bishop takes g4, and after bishop takes g4, white, of course, is up a piece, but it's not going to be enough with the number of pawns on the board. Black also, of course, did not really have to go for this. This pawn still being on f7 means that this bishop can comfortably move to the e6 square. But it was just kind of a matter of preference for Magnus. He saw this concrete way to kind of end the game. F takes, rook g6, king f2, rook takes g4 is the point. No real way to defend that g-pawn for white. And then from here, rook c4 is also a nice idea by black to pick up this final pawn. Rook a8 check, king h7, knight d7, and now, with all the pawns off the board, the absolute best that white could hope for is rook and bishop against rook, but you're never really going to get to that endgame here. These pawns are connected and totally safe, and they played on for quite a little bit, but this was not enough for MVL to create any more winning chances in this game. The c-pawn fell pretty easily, but now, after a trade, it was knight and rook against rook. With this extra pawn, it is a dead draw. Rook h1 check played, and that is the repetition, and the game is a dead draw. So this was kind of the main variation of the Berlin, and somehow, someway, MVL did manage to generate some chances against the world champion. Of course, in this case, it wasn't enough, but really clever ideas to focus on there. And I do want to come back for just a second and review those key ideas that got him to this position. So here, knight takes e6 is by far the main move, but f3 is MVL's choice to keep more pieces on the board and go for these interesting imbalances in the endgame. Knight e4 and then e6 to follow. And with these pawn sacrifices, one more critical move, c4 here, and now I think white is just comfortably better. It's easier to play this position with white, in my opinion. You know, the move rook d4 is nice, and it's difficult to find ways to get the black pieces into the game. That being said, there is one game, I know we're focusing on MVL here, there is one game in this line that I did want to show you guys. It is Giri's game, and I want to show you how this can kind of go wrong. So I'm going to speed through the opening here. It's just the mainline Berlin stuff that we were looking at. Rook a d1, knight g5 as we've seen, rook h6, this is the same position we saw, rook e1, bishop b4, g4, takes, knight e7, and here he did try MVL's move f3. In this game though, after bishop takes c3, takes, bishop a2, same position, knight e4, rook h8, e6, same position, takes. Here, of course, rather than knight d5, as Magnus played, Sergey tried b5. Now bishop e5, rook g8, knight c5, knight d5. This is all still perfectly fine for white. And then Giri played the very strange move f4, which simply loses the game. I don't know why you would play this move. Of course, I'm sure everybody at home sees the idea here for white. Of course, you need to play c4 once again, and then he could have gotten very similar counterplay to what we just saw in the previous game. But notably, things can go wrong for white here, but f4 is quite a crazy miss. I don't know how this actually happened in Giri's mind. So that's the other game to make it this far to this position. But unfortunately, we didn't get to see much of a game there because Giri blundered in a g-pawn, which is just, of course, not so good. All right, with that in mind, let's move on to the next main game I want to look at. This is one between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Veselin Topalov. In this game, Topalov went for the kind of other main plan in the Berlin. So I wanted to introduce this one to you guys, see how Maxime plays against this one, see if he can once again manage to generate some winning chances. So of course, we start with the Berlin. D4, we go for the endgame line. That's what we're analyzing. H3 is MVL's choice. And now, rather than the king e8 stuff that we were looking at in the previous games, here Topalov goes for the move bishop d7. And this is a slightly different way of playing it, even if it's not immediately apparent why it's going to be different. With bishop d7, black is not developing the bishop, to perhaps the most active square on e6, pressuring the queen side, but he is vacating this square on d7 for the king. So rather than king e8 in this game, expect to see Topalov try to go the other way with the king, over to c8. Rook d1 is the main move here for white, pressuring this bishop. Bishop e7 is perfectly natural for black, getting developed. And now, once again, we see white go for this idea with g4. Note that the move h5 is very much not really seen here, because in this variation, without the king on e8, you do have to be very, very wary of knight g5 ideas. And all of a sudden, things could go quite wrong for you if you're not careful. So that's why bishop e7 is nice, guarding this square on g5. Now, if knight g5, the move bishop takes g5 would be perfectly playable, and you can't even get away with king e8 here, because after knight takes f7, king takes f7, rook takes d7, this is no longer coming with check, and you can get quite active quite fast. So just some opening nuances there for you. Bishop e7, not h5 in this line, despite h5 being the main move in the previous line. And once again, MVL goes for the direct g4, knight h4. We see these knights come off the board, and now knight d2. And this is still pretty mainline stuff here. So knight d2, king c8, knight up to f3, hits this bishop, bishop back to e7. And now MVL plays the move bishop g5, trying to trade off this guy for this guy. And while this isn't the worst idea for black to even take, of course you're going to run into some real problems on this f7 square if you're not careful. So the 5 times this has been reached over the board, the move bishop c5 was played. And now from here, MVL continues playing quite naturally, just develops this rook up to d3. b6 now for black is sensible, giving this king another square, able to bring this rook into play. And also, you know, just supporting the c5 square if we ever want to play c5 and bishop c6. So bishop e3 now for white. We see bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, and h6. Now we have this position in the endgame, where it is the classic Berlin structure. There's only one minor piece left on the board, though. That is this knight versus this bishop. And so we'll see which minor piece ends up being better here. First, the move rook d1 and c5 is played, and then I'd like you guys to try to come up with a maneuver for white to really improve his piece, his minor piece, the knight specifically, and put a lot of pressure on black. It can become very, very easy for black to go wrong here. Yasser went over this in his Berlin video. Well, Yasser has good taste. Drink some water, bro. I've got a Sprite here. Good call, though. Good call, though. The move e6 has been suggested. The moves knight d2 to c4 have been suggested. I don't really think the c4 square is much of an improvement for the knight in this case. Just for example, let's say some nothing move, even if you do get knight c4. These squares are all very easily defended by the black pawns, and this knight isn't doing much over here. The move e6 isn't quite right in this particular position, because we can just take with the bishop. But this e6 threat is one of the critical ideas for white in this position. You know, the threat of playing e6 is always kind of looming. And then, yeah, it looks like some people have it now. The move, of course, is knight h4, aiming for this f5 square. Now, at first glance, when I saw the move knight h4, I was like, well, okay, I mean, you can play knight h4, but it doesn't really seem to do a lot. I'm just going to play the move g6, and now the f5 square is mine. And what is your knight doing on h4, actually? I'm not so sure. I would like to ask you, sir, what is your knight doing? And then, you know, at first glance, I was like, yeah, and I just follow up with bishop e6, play rook d8, get my king out of the way, and life is good. But, of course, white does have a very direct move here that is good for him. And I think some of you guys probably have some idea of what that move is already. Of course, the move I'm talking about is this key idea that was mentioned on the previous turn. It's e6 here. e6 is the idea for white to try and play for an edge here. If bishop takes e6, well, now the nice sacrifice knight takes e6 comes on the board. And this bishop is a little bit loose on e6. Are the zombies attacking upstairs? Who knows, Jim? Who knows what they're doing up there? But it is kind of terrifying sounding. Anyways, so g6 cannot be played, which is why Topalov went for the move g5 in this case, just hitting this knight directly and saying, well, okay, if you're going to f5, you're not going to be looking at my pawn on g7. I've already dealt with that, and you have no way back through the h4 square. So knight f5 was played. And now we get this interesting position, and unfortunately for Topalov here, he did kind of just blunder into a significantly worse endgame that MVL managed to go on to win. But the position is actually very, very interesting still. It's difficult to pinpoint if black has really done much wrong here. So far, black has just done very, very natural moves. Some pieces were traded off the board. But now, all of a sudden, with this knight on f5, perhaps white has a little bit of an advantage. I think the best move in this position is actually to play the move bishop e6. Note that if you come out the other way to b5, for example, you're kind of running the risk of e6 coming on the board, and this might just kind of run over your entire position. For example, takes, play a move like king b7, well, all of a sudden the h6 pawn is already hanging. For example, takes, and now knight f7, and you don't really regain this pawn quite so easily. So I think the best move is to play bishop e6, preventing this e6 break, but now the move knight g7 is available to white, and this is starting to break down the blockade just a little bit. I think really the only main move here has to be rook d8, trying to go for a little bit of a simpler endgame. Now after rook takes d8, and more pieces come off the board, for example, the move rook f3 and rook f6, and this endgame might be holding. It probably is holding, but it is going to be very, very uncomfortable for black to deal with. There's really two things you can do here. You can either come to d8 or h8. d8 is the more active try. h8 is kind of the try that says, I'm just going to defend my pawn, and what are you going to do? What are you going to do about it? Nothing, I hope. But now, white does have a way to break through here. If you guys want to try to find it at home, go ahead. I'm just going to show it. It is this move f4. The move f4, and now after g takes f4, the king comes up the board, and white will be able to create a passed pawn and play for a win. Now, if you do play the move rook d8 here, going for activity, this might be a better try. For example, rook takes h6, rook d2, rook h7 is check, king e8. Note if you play king d8, then the move f4 is actually very, very strong, creating a passed pawn immediately. So king e8 is a little bit better, keeping an eye on this king side a little bit more, keeping this king closer to this passed pawn. So king e8, for example, rook takes c7, rook takes c2, and now even moves like b4. And I am not entirely certain what's going on in this endgame, but it does kind of start to feel like white is the one playing for an edge with this 3 versus 1 going on over here. So I think maybe this endgame is something that that white can actually try and play for an advantage. There are other ideas like playing an earlier h4 that are conceivable. There are also, you know, you can't really play a move like king f1, just trying to guard, because this rook is going to get active anyways, whether you like it or not. So I think bishop e6 was a much better try for Topalov. Instead, though, he plays the move bishop takes f5. And now after g takes f5, black is really in for a struggle in this position. This is going to be a little bit of a struggle for black. Yeah, it says the class is new. The class has been around a little bit now, pawns, but it feels like it's brand new. Okay, so now after g takes f5, we do have this opportunity to always create a passed pawn, and without the minor pieces on the board, unless black can get the rooks active very, very early on, white has a huge head start with both these rooks on great squares threatening to invade. If you go for a similar line that we just looked at with a move like rook d8, well, you can take this, and then white can simply sit on the position. And that is kind of the difference here. In that previous position, it wasn't so easy to just kind of sit and do nothing because the rook came to e5 or d5 or d2 and created immediate threats. But now our king just has a road of entry and our rook can very adequately guard all of our weaknesses from a square like d2. Just for example, if rook d8 here, the move rook d3 is potentially playable. The move rook e2 I think is also potentially playable. But you might want to look out for this move, rook d4. So maybe even rook d3 here, when I'm pretty sure you can't go in for the king and pawn endgames. And that would be very, very difficult for black. So instead, Topalov tries to keep both rooks on the board and play for counterplay this way. But now, the same idea by white, simply king g2. You get this king active, and it's going to be tough to hold on. Rook d8, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, and we do get kind of a version of what we just saw. And now king f3. White is just threatening to invade directly. c4 was Topalov's trying to get these pawns a little bit further up the board so they can become more relevant. But now rook e4, b5 defends the pawn, but simply king g4 at this point. And this is dead, with the dual threats of e6 pushing the queen and king h5 coming. Black doesn't have time to come down the board because this pawn is far too strong. And this is just simply lost now for Topalov. King f5, e7, king g6, and after king g6, Veselin simply resigns. And it's kind of a funny position to resign at first glance. You know, it looks like the king is blockading. Maybe black can play on for a little bit. But the simple fact of the matter is that the rook on h8 is trapped. So that rook is going to die in the next few moves. You play anything, king g7, and the rook dies. King here, king g7, king f7, and the rook dies. Unfortunate for Topalov. So this was a big win by MVL in the Berlin endgame. And this idea of knight h4 to f5 proves to be a little bit problematic for black in this specific line. Now, I do think the move bishop e6 very much might be holding with this idea of rook d8, but it's certainly not easy to play as black. You know, you see this rook coming on f6, and it does look quite terrifying, and it does look kind of just optically very, very strong for white. So where could black have improved? Of course, this bishop takes f5 move was a huge mistake. Here, perhaps even, the move bishop e7 would have been a simpler try. I think the pure knight versus bishop endgame is something slightly advantageous to white. Of course, at this point, white can still play on. You know, he's getting activity on this file. But I do like keeping this bishop around for black, I think. Just for a little bit longer, at least. Okay. The pieces are on their starting squares in the final position. Yeah, that's a nice note. All right, I have one more Berlin endgame to show you guys after that one. So we've seen kind of two of the main plans by black so far. Now, why don't we take a look at a game MVL had against the one and only David Howell. David Howell, one of the top English players, been in and out of the 2700s for quite some time now. So this game, like all the other games, starts with e4 and goes directly into the Berlin. Takes, h3. First is the move order chosen by MVL. Now, knight e7 is played in this game, and this one is slightly non-standard, I must be honest with you. Knight e7, not the most common plan by any stretch. Much more common are these bishop d7 or king e8 positions, but knight e7 instead is David Howell's try here. Rook d1 is a check, king e8 out of check. Now knight c3, and the idea for black with this move, knight e7, is kind of, I was going to say twofold, but really multifold. It steps out of g4 first of all. This was a very, very common idea for white that we were looking at to gain some space on the king's side, hitting this knight. It also challenges this e-pawn with this next move, knight g6. This is the main square that black wanted to put this knight on, challenging this pawn. And now there are a variety of moves here for white. The move b3 is perhaps the most common, the idea being bishop e7. This knight can come back to e2, and this bishop can come out to b2. There's also the idea of just bishop e3. There's knight e2 here directly. There's even moves like bishop g5, rook e1. In the game, MVL plays the move knight to d4. And this is slightly less common than those other moves that I listed. And the reason for that is pretty apparent. This pawn is undefended. And so you can, in fact, actually capture this pawn if you so desire. The reason white sacrifices it here is because he wants to go for bishop f4 and challenging this c pawn, as we saw with this e6 move in an earlier position. So now f6 would come on the board likely, and the move bishop takes e5, f takes e5 has been played a couple times. For example, knight f3, bishop d6, knight takes e5 is regaining the pawn. You don't really want to take this guy because of this pin, giving up the bishop pair. And now after bishop f5, rook d2 is the most common move. And this has been played a couple times, both of those times to a draw. And so this knight takes e5 move is perhaps black's best chance at playing for a draw here. But David Howell chose instead to play bishop d7, opting for more pure, just Berlin endgame type positions where this pawn on e5 does remain. Now, though, the problem for black is white isn't going to give you a second chance to capture this pawn on e5. Of course, now the move f4 comes on the board, and this is how MVL is playing for an advantage here. Rook d8 is black's idea, getting this rook directly into the game, and now simply bishop e3 is developing. h5 on the board for black, still wanting to keep an eye on the g4 square. And now the easy rook d2. And white just doubles on the d file after bishop e7. Now this position, as with many positions in the Berlin, is not a huge edge for white, but I do feel, once again, that it is easier to play for white. White can create problems for black, and black is going to have to work slightly harder than white to solve those problems. In the game, David Howell chose a6. And now after the move knight e4, you just see optically that white's pieces do look very well placed in the center, while the black bishops look a little bit compressed on e7 and d7. Now knight h4 was played in the game, and I do think that this move was in fact a little bit of a mistake here. It does just allow this move bishop f2, which hits this knight, and now this knight really doesn't have anything better to do than come back to g6. This was probably an attempt by David Howell to get a quick repetition. You know, want to see, okay, MVL went in for this Berlin endgame line. Can we just like wash our hands, be done with this game? But unfortunately, MVL wanted to play on here. Now bishop g3 comes on the board, and after h4, bishop h2. This bishop has perhaps slightly been improved, supporting these pawns from behind instead of guarding this empty diagonal. Now the move c5 comes on the board for black. This is a very, very common move by black, giving this bishop a little bit more scope and taking away the d4 square from the white knights. Knight f3 comes on the board. And knight back to f8 is another slightly strange looking move. And MVL just plays these positions very, very simply. King f2, getting the king into the game. Now, rook h5 comes on the board for black. Once again, with this king on e8, it's difficult to get the rook into the game on this back row. So you'll see black play for activity with moves like rook h5 or rook h6. Now, knight c3 is the big reroute in this game for MVL. Once this pawn moves from c6 to c5, very often the downside is it does give up control of the d5 square. And that's exactly what knight c3 is aimed at taking advantage of. The move bishop f5 was played, and now knight d5 is the natural follow-up for MVL. Knight e6 comes on the board, defending the c7 pawn, and now c4 by white. And this is how games in the Berlin are sometimes, rarely, of course, but sometimes end up being decisive. Both players have kind of made an effort to keep a few more pieces on the board here. And as such, there is a lot more room for error. In this case, David Howell makes a good move, b5, challenging White's claim to the c4, and indirectly the d5 square. And MVL kind of buckles under this and does just take off this light squared bishop on e7. Rook takes d2 is inserted, rook takes d2, king takes e7, and now c takes b5, a takes b5, and MVL is hoping against hope for an outside passed pawn on the a file in some type of way to play on with this. Now king e3 is the very principled endgame move by MVL, getting the king further into the center. And g5 to follow. Now knight takes g5, knight takes g5, f takes g5, rook takes g5, and king f4 hits both pieces, but rook h5 saves both pieces. Now rook d5 comes on the board, hitting some of these queenside weaknesses. c6 is nice by black. Now rook takes c5, king d7. And this is, not going to lie to you guys, a totally equal endgame here. This one is pretty much just dead equal. So I wanted to pause here for a moment. Looks like we've still got plenty of time. I was kind of rushing there, but we do have time here to pause. And I want to ask you guys, if your name is Maxime Vachier-Lagrave here, what are you doing to play on for a win in this position? Which pawns are you looking to target, and which threats are you hoping to make? Not necessarily against pawns, but could be any kind of threat. What threats are you trying to make here? How do you pose problems to your opponent? My question to you. So Chess King has one idea. Bishop g1 to f2 is one idea. So these are some pretty good ideas. Use the e pawn, bishop g1, bishop f2, target the backward pawn on c6. So as always in endgames like these, even in endgames where you're not necessarily better, endgames where it's more natural for you to play, the way to press on is to try and stretch the opponent's pieces just a little bit thin. You want to look to create threats on both sides of the board. So I really do think this idea with bishop g1 to f2 isn't the worst idea ever created, because you're trying to create threats on this king side as well as on the c6 pawn on the queen side. MVL chose to first include this b3 move, and this is the other idea that you guys mentioned in the chat. You want to always be hinting that you're going to play the move a4. Now, I don't recommend that you play the move a4 directly, like right away. The idea is potentially a later a4, but it's another one of those cases where the threat is sometimes stronger than the execution. So by playing b3 and not playing a4, you're kind of leaving it up to your opponent to be calculating a4 on every turn, making sure a4 on every turn is not good enough to win the game. So b3 is a great start. And now, after bishop back to e6, the move rook c2 was kind of required to guard the second rank against any rook shenanigans here. Rook f5 check did come on the board, and now king e3. Rook g5. Bishop f4 is nice to hit the rook, and rook back to the g6 square. And so white hasn't made a ton of progress here just yet, but he is beginning to organize his pieces to guard all of his weaknesses and still create threats against the opponent. Of course, the c6 pawn is still challenged, the a4 threats still exist. Luckily for black, though, he has kind of solved this problem of the h4 pawn. So here, the move king f2 was MVL's choice, overprotecting this pawn and hinting that potentially one day he's going to play a move like g4 or g3. David Howell aimed to simplify immediately the move f6, E takes f6, rook takes f6 was played. Rook d2 is a check. King e7, and now see if you can find the move that MVL found in order to play this position for an advantage. It's time to put on your tactical hats. Put on your tactic hats. See if you can find something. Put on your tactic hats. Rook d6 hangs all of your remaining pieces. I don't recommend it. Bishop g5 is illegal, unfortunately. Bishop g5 would be a fantastic move if only it were legal. So some people have found the correct first move, but in order to play the correct first move, you do need to see a pretty counterintuitive tactical line. So I challenge you guys to come up with that tactical line, those of you who are giving just one move here. So, okay, the move king e3. The move king e3 is perfectly fine. I'm not going to tell you that king e3 is a bad move. But it is not really changing the position meaningfully. Your opponent's just going to play rook g6, and you're back to more of the same here. You're back to more of the same. Maybe your king can start coming up even further, but you do have to realize that like this is starting to even turn against you with your king being so far away. So not king e3, not what I'm looking for here. Okay, if I can make two moves in a row, king e3, bishop g5 would be great. But after king e3, black's going to play rook g6. So the move that is correct, the first move that some people have said, is in fact going to be the move g3. I think this is the best way for white to try to win here. And with, perfect hindsight, white did end up winning, so of course it was the best try. Other moves, I mean, these are like playable moves, but like, why would you want to do this to yourself? Even you're not really playing for a win here. You're just trying to find creative ways to not play king e3. But the move g3 is quite nice. The point being, you're daring your opponent to kind of, go for some of this, and you're attempting to use the immediate configuration of the pieces to create a passed pawn here on the king side. For example, if the move bishop to d5 comes on the board, well, now we can play the move king g1, and we are in fact going to end up with a passed pawn over here. Now, I'm not saying that's always going to be enough to win, but a passed pawn is a passed pawn, and it's much better than what white had initially. Now, that tactical line that I said you guys must be able to see is actually the one after bishop takes h3. And this was played in the game. There's really only one way here for white to keep winning chances alive. Otherwise, you just kind of have lost your extra pawn on h3. So if you guys want to find it, go ahead, pause now, try and find it. I'm just going to show it. The move here is g takes h4, believe it or not, hanging this bishop with check. Rook takes f4, check, king g3. And now these two pieces are both attacked, and it is difficult to defend them. In fact, I dare say impossible. So rook f1 was played in the game. In fact, rook f8 was a little bit better, perhaps, to try and defend. You can get at this a pawn immediately, and also keep in front of the pawn here. But now, after king takes h3, c5 was David Howell's try. Rook c2 is challenging these pawns. King d6, and now this pawn starts to run. King d5, and now white to move and win. White to move and win. There's only one winning move in this position. Let's see if you guys can find it. A4 has been suggested. I get the feeling A4 was suggested because because I accidentally hovered over this, which makes a blue arrow showing a4. But I fooled you once again. a4 is not the move. That'll show you. Everybody thinks a4. Stupid Caleb showed the move. Not this time. Not this time. Okay. So, in fact, some people do have it. The move h6 here looks to be the most natural, but this is, in fact, going to be a pretty big mistake here. You've put too much distance between the pawn and your king, and after the move rook f6, this pawn is actually indefensible. h7 means rook h6. So the move that is required and the move that does win is this move rook h2. Now, of course, the rook supports the pawn from behind, and we can push this pawn as far as we want, able to step our king out of the way whenever necessary. If black went for a blockade here, we would simply play h6, rook h7, and now this king is going to be in time to be pretty nasty. And if this king comes back to defend the rook, this rook just steps over to the queen side and starts cleaning up. In the game, black did not go for this type of blockade, instead opting to just push c4, trying to make his own queen before a white queen's, but of course it is just not going to work out here for him. h6, MVL ignores the c-pawn, c3, h7, rook f8 now, and now king g4 is making a threat. Rook h8 was played in the game. Now king f5 is a nice little accuracy. One small note about king and pawn endgames is there are many different paths from one square to the next that take the same number of moves. For example, the most direct seems to be king g5, king g6, king g7, but that takes 3 moves, and you don't lose any time by going to f5 first, and it is nice to shoulder this king out of the way. However, MVL has actually blundered a small bit here. It was possible now for David Howell to draw this position with accurate play. He starts with the move king d4, which is fine, king g6 now. And there is, I believe, one move here that draws the game for black. One move to draw the game. Everyone is congratulating me on my trick. Here, you want to see me do it again? What? What? Was that the right move? What? Oh, is that the right move? Oh, is that the right move? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. King d3, only move king d3, king d3, king d3. Rook takes h7. So you don't want to play rook takes h7 until you are absolutely forced to. Until you are absolutely forced to. Otherwise, you're just giving your opponent extra time. Still don't understand why he didn't pin the rook with the bishop when he had the chance. Sorry, I never showed it on the board. That's because I couldn't show it on the board. It was literally illegal to pin the bishop. The bishop was pinned, or to pin the rook. The bishop itself was pinned to the king. So of course it is this move b4. And the point here is that the king and pawn endgame that ensues is actually going to be drawn. So king g7 forces this pawn off the board. King takes h7. But now after king d3, c2, c1, this rook has to trade itself for this guy. And with b4 on the board, the white king simply isn't in time. Now, okay, I guess I can show this really quick. So king d3, just for example, king g6, c2, and I've managed to actually lose this now for white, which is impressive to say the least. So clearly, you don't want this pawn on b4 because you get trebucheted and might lose. So white, in this case, would actually have to start giving some checks with this stuff. And this would be the draw. But, okay, in the game, David Howell played the move king d3. So now, what is the way to win the game? What is the way to win the game? with white here. The cleanest way to win the game. B4 for white is what is being suggested. So B4 actually doesn't get the job done here because you're just losing too much time. C2 is going to be played, and you're going to run into some similar situations here. So yeah, you guys have it now. The move is A4. You just create another passed pawn. And now, of course, the king and pawn endgames are all going to be losing because this guy is behind that guy. And that is exactly what happened in the game. Rook A8, H8 queen, and then David Howell had to go in for the losing queen versus rook endgame, which MVL just finessed out of his mind. Easiest win of his life, right? Easiest win of his life. Never in doubt. Yeah, you just do this and then check, and then yeah, the zug, and then the more check, and then this guy drops. So pretty nice win there from MVL in this Berlin endgame once again. For those curious, the move that blunders the win here is actually going for this h6 move immediately. Much better is to take on c4, and after b takes c4, of course, you always have this option to play the move a4 whenever you need to create this passed pawn. And now you can just push this pawn to victory. Rook f8, h7, rook h8, king g4, and there's no way to be fast enough here with black. This pawn is always going to run. So that is more or less MVL's take on the various plans for black in the Berlin endgame. Of course, you know, with great perfect play, black can draw the game of chess. That's just how it works. But MVL is really the player I would turn to in the Berlin endgame for interesting ideas in ways to create practical problems for black. Hopefully, this has given you all some ideas to go home and try against your, you know, least favorite sparring partner who always plays the Berlin endgame against you, ruins your Ruy Lopez's. Hopefully, you can score a few wins using these clever ideas from MVL. That's all from us tonight on the YouTube channel here. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're watching live, be sure to head over to the Twitch channel for another episode of Analyze Your Games. If you're watching the video, that is it for tonight. My name is Caleb Denby, and thank you for watching.